So, you think kings were noble? Cute dot, let me ruin that image for you. When you imagine a king, maybe you see a wise man on a golden throne, someone kind, brave, a true protector of the people. Maybe you imagine shiny armor, heroic speeches, and a perfect sense of justice. That's what the fairy tales tell you. But reality? It was far less romantic. The truth is, many medieval kings were, well, let's just say they were not the gentle fathers of their nations. They were human, flawed, selfish, often cruel, and sometimes downright strange. Yes, some had moments of greatness, but many more had moments of pure madness, greed, and desire. They lived in castles, surrounded by silk and gold, while their people froze in the mud outside. They believed God chose them to rule, which made them think they could do anything they wanted. And they did. Oh, they really did. Let's set the scene. Medieval Europe. The smell of the streets was terrible raw. Sewage, sweat, and sickness. People were starving. Plagues wiped out entire towns. And in the middle of all this misery, there were kings feasting on endless tables of roasted meat, drinking wine as if it were water dot, but the feasting was just the polite part. What they did behind closed doors was far stranger. Some kings married their cousins to keep the bloodline pure. Others built hidden rooms filled with mistresses, as if their palaces were pleasure houses instead of places of rule. Some ruled with violence, ordering torture as if it were entertainment. And then there were the truly bizarre ones, the kings who believed they were animals, who barked like dogs or clucked like chickens. Yes, really, if you think the modern world is strange, you haven't heard what happened in these royal courts. The stories that survived are a mix of dark comedy and horror. They show you that power without limits can twist even the strongest minds into something unrecognizable dot, because being a king wasn't just a job. It was absolute power. And absolute power, as they say, does strange things to people. Take a moment and picture it, a dark medieval castle. Tall stone walls dripping with moisture. The only light is from smoky candles. In one room, servants carry trays of exotic food while musicians play soft tunes. In another room, peasants are begging for justice, but the king is too busy with his latest obsession, whatever that might be. Some kings were obsessed with food, eating themselves sick while people starved. Some were obsessed with women, collecting mistresses like trophies. Others were obsessed with pain of others, of course, never their own. And some were just plain mad, lost in their own twisted minds while their advisors tried desperately to keep the kingdom from falling apart. This is the side of royalty you don't see in the shiny paintings dot, and before you think, oh, but surely, not all kings were like that. You're right, some were better. But the ones who left the strangest marks in history, they were the ones who couldn't control themselves. And those are the ones we're going to talk about. Well, look at kings who turned their palaces into prisons of pleasure. Kings who thought marrying their own family members was a good idea. Kings who held feasts so large the leftover food could have saved entire villages from hunger. Kings who made decisions that would sound like the plot of a bad fantasy novel, but they were real. And just to keep things interesting, there will also be a few moments of dark humor. Because history is messy, it's tragic, it's weird, and sometimes it's so ridiculous that you can't help but laugh, even while shaking your head in disbelief. Why does this matter? Because it shows us something about human nature. Even the people who had everything, wealth, power, armies, gold, lands, still wanted more control, more pleasure, more glory. And when no one could stop them, they crossed lines you wouldn't believe dot. So if you were imagining a noble king on a white horse riding to save his people, I'm sorry, the real medieval kings were far more complicated. Some were clever, yes, some were brave sometimes, but many were selfish beyond reason. and a few were perverted in ways that still make historians cringe. Now, don't worry, this won't be a history lesson full of boring dates and names. You don't need to memorize anything. Just listen. I'll tell you the strangest, darkest, and sometimes funniest secrets of royal life, slowly, calmly, like someone reading you bedtime gossip from hundreds of years ago. We'll talk about kings who locked away entire harems inside hidden chambers of the castle. Kings who believed bathing was a sin, so they walked around stinking like a swamp. Kings who thought the solution to every problem was another war. And of course, the ones who lost themselves completely in their own madness. It's a strange journey. You might feel a little uneasy. You might even laugh. But one thing is sure, you'll never look at the word royalty the same way again. So settle in. You're safe. You're not in a damp castle filled with secrets. You're not a servant waiting to be punished for looking at the king the wrong way. You're just here, listening. Let the candlelight flicker in your imagination. Let the stone halls echo with the whispers of the past, because the kings are waiting. And they're not what you expect, ready to meet your first nightmare. Let's begin. So let's talk about family. Most people love their families. They visit on holidays, share a few awkward conversations, maybe argue about who gets the biggest slice of pie. And then they go home. Normal people don't usually marry. They're cousins, but medieval royalty? Oh, they took family love to another level. Meet the king who was obsessed with keeping his royal blood pure. You see, back then, kings believed their blood was special, holy, almost magical. They thought that mixing it with ordinary people's blood would somehow weaken their power. So the best way to keep the bloodline strong was simple. Marry someone from your own royal family. Someone close. Sometimes too close. This king, let's call him the Purity King, didn't just believe in marrying within the family. He made it his entire life mission. Cousins, perfect. Nieces, even better. He created a royal dating pool so small that it basically turned into a puddle. And the results? Oh, they were interesting. At first, it seemed practical. He thought, why marry a stranger when I can marry my cousin? She already has royal blood, and I already know her family tree. But with each generation of cousin marriages, the family tree started looking less like a tree and more like a twisted vine. The same names kept repeating, the same faces too. It got to the point where his palace felt more like a very awkward family reunion. Imagine the wedding guest list. Everyone there was already related to everyone else. The priest probably didn't even need to ask, does anyone object? Because, well, who could? They were all in the same boat. And you'd think one or two cousin weddings would have been enough. But no. This king married multiple cousins. He encouraged his children to do the same. He even matched up his nieces and nephews like some twisted royal dating service. And every time someone suggested marrying outside the family, he waved his hand dramatically and said, no, we must protect the purity of our royal blood. Now, here's the problem with that. When you keep mixing the same genes over and over, things don't go well. Let's put it politely. The families started looking a little too similar. Some had odd jawlines. Others developed strange health problems, and the famous royal chin. It became more exaggerated with every generation, like a cartoon version of itself. The court doctors whispered quietly, but they knew. They saw the signs. Weak immune systems, strange illnesses that didn't exist in normal people. But no one could say anything because the king didn't want to hear the truth. To him, the family was perfect, perfectly royal. And of course, this obsession didn't just affect his looks or health, it affected his mind. The king himself became a little off. He was known for making odd decisions, for throwing tantrums over the smallest things. One day he would host a giant feast, and the next day he would ban all music in the castle because it offended his royal ears. People began to wonder if his royal blood was maybe too pure, but still, he kept going. More cousin weddings, more strange alliances. The palace turned into a royal maze where you could barely tell who was whose aunt, cousin, or step something. And if you're confused just hearing about it, imagine how confused the poor record keepers were. Even the common people noticed. They called it marrying the family tree. Some joked that the royal children didn't even need family portraits. They could just look in a mirror. The peasants, who had no choice but to marry outside their tiny villages, shook their heads and said, well, at least we're not that rich. But of course, this king didn't care what the peasants thought. He was too busy planning yet another royal wedding to yet another royal cousin. In his mind, he was doing something noble. He was protecting history, protecting the crown, protecting the divine blood that made him special. Except it didn't. The reality was harsh. His heirs were weaker. His advisors grew frustrated. The once mighty royal family slowly became a collection of sickly, confused, and slightly ridiculous rulers. And all because one man couldn't let go of the idea that only royal blood was good enough. It's almost funny in a sad way. He wanted strength. He wanted perfection. But by keeping the bloodline closed, he created the opposite fragility. And yet, he never saw it. Until the very end, he believed he was doing the right thing. And here's the best part. After all those cousin weddings, after all those pure royal unions, what happened? The dynasty eventually collapsed. It couldn't. Sussed. There were pies filled with live birds, so when you cut them open, they flew out across the hall. There were dishes soaked in sugar, a rare luxury at the time. There were pastries shaped like castles, towers of bread taller than a man. And always, always there was meat, so much meat. Geese, swans, deer, cows, pigs. If it moved, it probably ended up on the table. While the nobles chewed, the king made speeches about his generosity. He would raise his goblet of wine and say, "See how well I treat my loyal subjects." Meanwhile, those same subjects, peasants, farmers, workers were outside eating scraps, if they were lucky, but the king didn't care. For him, the banquet was proof of his greatness. The more he ate, the more it showed that the kingdom was strong. If he could waste food, it meant he had enough power to ignore hunger. It wasn't just about eating, though. It was about showing off. Imagine a table so long you can't see the end. Imagine gold plates, silver knives, cups made of crystal, servants carrying flaming dishes while trumpets announced every new course. And imagine the king sitting on a throne-like chair at the head of it all, laughing as he tore into a roasted leg of venison, grease dripping down his fingers. And when he was full, he didn't stop. No, medieval kings had a trick. If they wanted to keep eating, they simply excused themselves, went to a small side room, and forced themselves to make space so they could return and start again. Yes, that was a thing. It sounds disgusting because it was, but to them, it was normal. Eating until you couldn't breathe was seen as a sign of strength, and the king wanted everyone to know he was the strongest of them all. Meanwhile, the music played on. The dancers spun, the candles burned. Servants scurried back and forth, carrying trays heavier than their own bodies. And in the shadows, quiet eyes watched eyes of the lower servants who never got a single bite of the feast they were serving. Sometimes, the king added entertainment between courses. He'd have a bear brought into the hall on a chain, or a fool dressed in bright colors to tell silly jokes. Anything to keep the guests amused while they stuffed themselves. And then, of course, came the wine, barrels of it. Red wine, white wine, spiced wine. It poured like rivers, staining the tablecloths and the clothes of anyone too drunk to hold their cup. By the end of the night, half the nobles were asleep on the floor, their faces red, their stomachs bloated. King loved it. He loved seeing his court lose control. It reminded everyone that he was the only one allowed to rule in this madness. Outside, though, the reality was different. While the palace glowed with candlelight, the village streets were dark. While the king's table overflowed, the peasants' bowls were empty. Children went to bed with nothing but thin soup in their stomachs. Farmers worked from sunrise to sunset, only to hand over most of their harvest as taxes that paid for those very banquets. Some peasants would stand outside the palace gates, smelling the roasted meat in the air. They would hear the music, faintly in the distance, and they would go home, clutching their empty baskets, knowing none of it was for them. But the king? He didn't even think about it in his mind. The banquet was proof that the kingdom was rich, proof that he was a great ruler. He believed his excess was a reflection of success. He never realized, or maybe he didn't care, that his success was built on the suffering of his own people. And when the feast was over, the leftovers were thrown away, not given to the poor, not saved for later, just tossed out into the palace courtyard for dogs to eat. Yes, really. It's hard to imagine now, isn't it? A world where one man could eat enough for 50 people, while 50 people outside couldn't afford a loaf of bread. But that was medieval life. And here's the strangest part. These banquets didn't make the kings happier. They were never satisfied. There was always another feast, another excuse, another night of gluttony that ended in the same way, exhausted, drunk, and strangely empty, because no matter how much they ate, no matter how much they drank, the hunger for more never stopped. So the next time you sit down for a simple meal, be glad. At least your food doesn't come with the silent weight of a starving kingdom outside your door. And as they stuffed their faces, the people outside starved quietly. Let's leave the bedrooms for a moment and step into the dining hall. If you think a royal dinner was just a polite meal with a little wine and bread, think again. Medieval kings didn't just eat, they performed their meals. Banquets were more than food. They were a display of power, wealth, and pure excess. Welcome to the banquets of madness. These feasts could last for hours, sometimes even days. Long, wooden tables were piled so high with food that you couldn't see the table itself. Roasted boars with apples in their mouths. Entire peacocks served with their feathers reattached so they still looked alive. Platters of exotic fruits brought from lands most peasants didn't even know existed. And this wasn't just for the king. He invited nobles, knights, and anyone he wanted to impress. Eating together wasn't about friendship, it was a competition. Who could eat the most? Who could drink the most? Who could stay conscious the longest before collapsing from too much wine? The king always won. Of course, he had help. Servants stood ready to refill his cup before it was even empty. Musicians played in the corner. Dancers entertained between courses. Jugglers tossed knives in the air. It was like a circus with food as the main attraction, and the food, it was not for the faint of heart. There were pies filled with live birds. So when you cut them open, they flew out across the hall. There were dishes soaked in sugar, a rare luxury at the time. There were pastries shaped like castles, towers of bread taller than a man, and always, always there was meat. So much meat. Geese, swans, deer, cows, pigs. If it moved, it probably ended up on the table. While the nobles chewed, the king made speeches about his generosity. He would raise his goblet of wine and say, "See how well I treat my loyal subjects." Meanwhile, those same subjects, peasants, farmers, workers, were outside eating scraps, if they were lucky, but the king didn't care. For him, the banquet was proof of his greatness. The more he ate, the more it showed that the kingdom was strong. If he could waste food, it meant he had enough power to ignore hunger. It wasn't just about eating, though. It was about showing off. Imagine a table so long you can't see the end. Imagine gold plates, silver knives, cups made of crystal, servants carrying flaming dishes while trumpets announced every new course. And imagine the king sitting on a throne-like chair at the head of it all, laughing as he tore into a roasted leg of venison, grease dripping down his fingers. And when he was full, he didn't stop. No, medieval kings had a trick. If they wanted to keep eating, they simply excused themselves, went to a small side room, and forced themselves to make space so they could return and start again. Yes, that was a thing. It sounds disgusting because it was, but to them, it was normal. Eating until you couldn't breathe was seen as a sign of strength, and the king wanted everyone to know he was the strongest of them all. Meanwhile, the music played on. The dancers spun, the candles burned. Servants scurried back and forth, carrying trays heavier than their own bodies. And in the shadows, quiet eyes watched eyes of the lower servants who never got a single bite of the feast they were serving. Sometimes, the king added entertainment between courses. He'd have a bear brought into the hall on a chain, or a fool dressed in bright colors to tell silly jokes. Anything to keep the guests amused while they stuffed themselves. And then, of course, came the wine, barrels of it. Red wine, white wine, spiced wine. It poured like rivers, staining the tablecloths and the clothes of anyone too drunk to hold their cup. By the end of the night, half the nobles were asleep on the floor, their faces red, their stomachs bloated. King loved it. He loved seeing his court lose control. It reminded everyone that he was the only one allowed to rule in this madness. Outside, though, the reality was different. While the palace glowed with candlelight, the village streets were dark. While the king's table overflowed, the peasants' bowls were empty. Children went to bed with nothing but thin soup in their stomachs. Farmers worked from sunrise to sunset, only to hand over most of their harvest as taxes that paid for those very banquets. Some peasants would stand outside the palace gates, smelling the roasted meat in the air. They would hear the music, faintly in the distance, and they would go home, clutching their empty baskets, knowing none of it was for them. But the king? He didn't even think about it. In his mind, the banquet was proof that the kingdom was rich, proof that he was a great ruler. He believed his excess was a reflection of success. He never realized, or maybe he didn't care, that his success was built on the suffering of his own people. And when the feast was over, the leftovers were thrown away, not given to the poor, not saved for later, just tossed out into the palace courtyard for dogs to eat. Yes, really. It's hard to imagine now, isn't it? A world where one man could eat enough for 50 people, while 50 people outside couldn't afford a loaf of bread. But that was medieval life. And here's the strangest part. These banquets didn't make the kings happier. They were never satisfied. There was always another feast, another excuse, another night of gluttony that ended in the same way, exhausted, drunk, and strangely empty, because no matter how much they ate, no matter how much they drank, the hunger for more never stopped. So the next time you sit down, outside the palace, people began to talk, quietly at first, then louder. They called him the parasite king. They said his greed for youth was cursed. Some even believed the kingdom's constant bad luck, failed harvests, strange illnesses was a punishment for his sins, but no one dared to confront him directly. He still had guards, he still had power. And then it stopped, not because he chose to stop, but because time finally won. One morning, the king didn't get out of bed. His body, once proud and strong, could no longer move. His skin was wrinkled, his voice weak. All the girls he had taken, all the rituals he believed in, they hadn't saved him, Dot, in the end. He died like any other man, old, frail, alone. When the news spread, the palace fell silent. The special rooms he built for his youth project were locked away. The servants cleaned them out, finding abandoned clothes, trinkets, and broken pieces of jewelry. Dot, the people outside didn't mourn him. They didn't hold grand ceremonies. They simply nodded and said, "Time caught him." It was a quiet justice. History remembers him not as a hero or even as a clever ruler, but as a warning. A man who was so afraid of losing his youth that he destroyed his humanity. A man who believed myths instead of accepting the simple truth. No one escapes time. And those girls, they were the true victims, forgotten by the court, lost in the shadows of history, their names never written. There, lives stolen for the foolish fear of one man. It is strange, isn't it? He wanted to hold on to life so badly, but in the process, he made so many lives smaller, sadder, and shorter. And in the end, it didn't even work. Time passed, and so did his victims. Some kings loved food, some loved women, and some loved fear. This king had everything: gold, armies, castles. But it wasn't enough. He wanted entertainment, something thrilling, something that made him feel powerful in a way that even a throne could not. So he turned cruelty into a pastime. He didn't see punishment as a necessary duty of ruling. No, for him, it was a show, a performance. He made torture into a kind of twisted theater. It began with small things. He liked to watch prisoners brought into the courtyard. He would sit on a raised platform, sipping wine as guards questioned the accused. He said it was about justice, but everyone knew it. It wasn't about the law. It was about what he felt when he saw fear in someone's eyes. At first, it was rare, only for serious crimes. But slowly, it became more frequent and more public. The king built a special area outside the palace, a stage surrounded by wooden benches. It looked almost like a market square, but it wasn't for selling goods. It was for displaying pain. He invited nobles, advisors, sometimes even foreign guests. It became an event. People wore fine clothes. Vendors sold snacks nearby. There were musicians who played soft tunes while the king made his grand entrance. And then the show began. The king would lean back in his chair and watch. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Sometimes he even gave instructions. Slower, he'd say calmly, or let them speak one last time. It wasn't about the crime. It wasn't about lessons. It was about the feeling he got from it. The quiet thrill and the crowd, they followed his lead. At first, they were nervous, uncomfortable, but the more it happened, the more normal it became. Some even started cheering, because when the king enjoys something, the people learn to enjoy it too. Stories say he smiled the most during these performances. Not during feasts, not during weddings. Only here, he would tap his fingers on the arm of his chair, humming softly, as if he were listening to music. There was one detail everyone remembered. After the show ended, he always clapped, slowly, quietly. Then he stood, thanked the crowd for attending, and left as if it were just another ordinary day. And then he'd go back to his palace for dinner. For the prisoners, there was no mercy. For the king, there was no guilt. He slept easily at night. He told himself it kept the kingdom in order. That fear was the best way to rule. But was it really about order? Or was it about the strange satisfaction he felt when he knew he could decide a person's fate with a single word? No one dared to ask. The nobles pretended it was fine. The advisors said nothing. The peasants whispered, but only in secret, because if the king heard, they might be the next entertainment. Even the guards started to change. At first, some of them looked away, but over time they got used to it. They became numb. They carried out the orders like clockwork, their faces blank, their hearts heavy, and yet the crowd still came. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they were afraid to refuse the king's invitation. Or maybe, over time, they lost a piece of their humanity too. It is strange how people can get used to anything. Happens often enough. The king even began experimenting. He asked inventors to design new devices for the performances. Some of them were more for show than for real harm, but others were not. He enjoyed the variety. And the worst part? Sometimes he didn't even wait for a crime. He would choose someone at random, a servant who spilled wine, a farmer who didn't bow low enough. Anyone could be turned into the next lesson for the crowd. The fear spread across the kingdom. People stopped laughing in public. They avoided eye contact. They spoke in hushed tones, never sure who might be listening. But inside the palace, the king was at peace. He believed he was loved and respected. He felt the silence of his people was loyalty, not terror. He never saw the truth. Years later, when he died, the people didn't cry. They didn't build statues or sing songs. They simply took down the wooden stage, burned the benches, and pretended it had never been there. But the memory lingered. Parents told their children stories of the king, who watched people suffer for fun, of the ruler who called cruelty justice, of the day they stood in the crowd, clapping, because they were too afraid not to. And even now, centuries later, his name is spoken in a whisper, not because he was strong, not because he was wise, but because he showed how easily power can twist a soul into something unrecognizable. It is a quiet kind of horror. No screaming battles, no dramatic wars, just slow, patient cruelty. And yes, people applauded. Different times. Power feels endless when you're young. When a king sits on his throne, surrounded by golden servants, it's easy to believe it will last forever. He thinks the cheers of the court will always echo in his ears. He thinks the crowds will always bow. He thinks fear will always keep him safe. But time has a way of catching even the most powerful. And for many kings, their final years were not filled with glory. They were filled with silence. The same men who once ruled over thousands often ended up alone. Some grew paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow. Some were abandoned by the same advisors who once swore loyalty. And some were taken down not by war or disease, but by the quiet betrayal of those closest to them. It always began the same way. First, the palace grew quieter. The grand banquets became smaller. The music stopped. The laughter faded. The king's friends, if they could even be called that, found excuses to leave. They visited less often, always with polite words, but eyes full of calculation. The king, once so proud, would sit by himself in long, empty halls. And then came the whispers. Whispers about rebellions, about secret plots, about sons and nephews who wanted the crown for themselves. The king would call for his guards, but even they didn't feel the same. Their eyes no longer showed fear. Some even looked at him with pity. He would lock the palace doors. He would check his food for poison. He would sleep with a weapon beside his bed. But no lock, no blade, no army could stop the slow creeping. Truth, his power was slipping away, and he knew it. It didn't matter how strong he had been. It didn't matter how many people he had scared into silence. Time turned even the fiercest ruler into a weak old man. Some went mad. They shouted at empty rooms. They gave orders to servants who were no longer there. They imagined old enemies, waiting in the dark. One king famously refused to leave his bedroom for years, convinced that death was waiting for him just outside the door. Others turned bitter. They blamed everyone around them, advisors, children, wives, guards. They accused them all of plotting. But really, there was no one left to plot because there was nothing left to take. The king had already lost the thing he feared most. Not the throne, not his life, but the illusion that he was untouchable, and some simply faded away. After all the noise, after all the years of feasts and wars and speeches, their end was quiet. No trumpets, no crowds. Just a cold room and the sound of their own breath growing weaker. It is strange, isn't it? These were men who had everything, wealth beyond measure, palaces filled with gold, armies that would destroy entire cities at their command. But in the end, none of it saved them from the same loneliness everyone fears, because power doesn't create love. People feared these kings, they obeyed them, but they didn't love them. And when fear fades, there is nothing left to hold anyone close. Even those who were not betrayed still felt the emptiness. The rooms that once echoed with music became hollow. The tables that once overflowed with food were left bare. The courtyards, once full of people, grew silent. And the king, sitting alone, finally saw the truth. He had built a kingdom that could not comfort him. Some tried to make peace at the end. They gave away gold. They freed prisoners. They begged priests for forgiveness. But forgiveness didn't erase the years. It didn't erase the pain they caused. It didn't erase the fact that, even as they asked for kindness, they had never shown it themselves. Others never apologized at all. They clung to their pride until their last breath. They told themselves they were right, that they were great, that history would remember them as heroes. But history is honest, even when kings are not. And what about those who were killed? Those stories were even sadder. Some were betrayed by their closest friends, a poisoned cup at dinner, a dagger in the back, a loyal servant who wasn't so loyal after all. And it always happened the same way. The king would look at his killer with surprise, as if he couldn't believe it, as if he had forgotten that fear and hate do not die just because you hold a crown. And then silence. No speeches, no final words. Just another powerful man falling alone with no one to save him. The palaces that once felt alive with noise would become tombs of memory. Servants would whisper about the past. This was the room where he made his cruelest order, they would say. This was the hall where he laughed as others begged for mercy. And now? Now it was just an empty space. People would walk through those same halls years later, feeling a strange chill, knowing something terrible had once lived there. But the man who caused it all was gone. And in a way, that's the final lesson. No matter how loud a king was in life, time always silences him. The throne that felt so heavy becomes just another piece of furniture. The gold he hoarded loses its meaning. And the people he ruled remember not the wealth or the power, but the fear. The end of a king is not always a grand story. Sometimes it is just nothing. A quiet room, a last breath, a whisper no one hears. Funny how the loudest kings died and the quietest rooms died. So, after hearing all of this, do you still think medieval times were charming? People sometimes imagine it was all knights, castles, and fairy tale romance. But now you know the truth. Behind the shiny armor and golden crowns were strange, lonely, and often cruel people. And the world they ruled was far from magical. Let's think about it for a moment. If you had been alive back then, chances are you wouldn't have been a king. You wouldn't have lived in a palace. No, you would have been one of the peasants. You would wake up in a tiny, cold hut with rats chewing on your grain. You would walk through muddy streets that smelled of smoke and sewage. And you would spend your whole day working the fields for someone else's benefit. And even if you were lucky enough to live in the castle, it wasn't that much better. The walls were cold and damp. There was no heating, no running water, no soap like we have today. People bathed rarely, if at all. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and illness. Food? Oh yes, kings had plenty. But you You'd be eating dark bread, maybe a little soup if you were lucky. Meat was rare, spices were rare. Sweet things were a luxury you might taste once in your lifetime, and the diseases, the plague was always waiting. A simple cut on your hand could mean infection and death. Doctors didn't know much. Their medicine was closer to guessing than science, and no one would wash their hands because they didn't even know it mattered. Life was short. Pain was common, and choices. You didn't have many, and yet, above it all, the kings sat in their castles, throwing feasts while the people outside starved, making strange rules that ruin lives, living in fear of betrayal while pretending they were gods among men. So no, medieval times weren't exactly the dream world some stories like to show, and even for the kings themselves, it wasn't so great. Sure, they had gold, they had power, but they were trapped by their own paranoia, surrounded by people who only stayed loyal out of fear. They trusted no one. They never really rested. Some turned to madness. Some turned to cruelty. And in the end, many of them died alone. You, on the other hand, you can lie in your bed tonight. Warm, safe, clean, no rats scratching at your floor. No king demanding your last coin for his feast. No plague creeping through your streets without warning. You can drink clean water. You can eat food that won't make you sick. You can visit a doctor who actually knows what they're doing. Think about that for a second. You don't have to worry about someone dragging you to a royal torture show. You don't have to work 14 hours a day just to pay taxes so a king can fill his table with roasted swans. You don't have to live in fear of a rooster king crowing at sunrise or a paranoid ruler accusing you of treason for looking at him the wrong way. Your life is quiet, safe, comfortable. Even the simplest things you have, now soft blankets, clean, clothes, a private room, would have felt like miracles in the Middle Ages. Most people then never knew what comfort truly was. So if you were ever jealous of royal life, don't be, because even the kings didn't really live well. Yes, they had silk robes. Yes, they had gold plates. But they also had endless stress, endless enemies, endless emptiness. And no amount of power or pleasure could save them from the one thing they feared most. Time took their youth. Time took their strength. Time took their crowns. And in the end, it took their lives, just like everyone else. So here you are, centuries later, listening to their strange, dark stories from the safety of your own bed. You can laugh softly at their ridiculousness. You can shake your head at their cruelty. You can feel a little sad for their loneliness. But you don't have to live it. Be grateful for that. Be grateful you weren't born in a world of mud and disease. Be grateful you weren't a servant in a cold castle or a farmer, starving in the shadow of a banquet hall. Be grateful you didn't have to watch a king lose his mind and drag a whole kingdom down with him. Tonight, you can close your eyes and know that history is behind you. The madness, the hunger, the fear, it's all gone now. Just echoes and old books and quiet whispers. So still want to be a medieval king? Sweet dreams,